Hi, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. It's 9 o'clock sharp, so we'd love to get started on this, well, certainly sunny day in Cape Town. Hope everyone's well around the country or around the world if you're joining from far away, and hope you can all hear me clearly. Luckily, in my region in Cape Town, I think the load shedding kicks in at about 12, so just wishing you all luck with our various contexts today. We're just welcoming in a few more guests, but in the meantime, I'll just start with a bit of context about our Insights in Action series with Kantar. This is our 11th session, and it's just super exciting to be here today. This particular presentation is just jam-packed with insights, statistics, and not only looking at where we are now, but actually now what, as you can see from the title slide that we have up here today. So just a note that the series that we have here, which are now hosted every second Wednesday, is powered by Kantar's COVID-19 series of studies. It's actually, this one is injected with further data from their global studies, so even more exciting. And we can't wait to hear from Thandiwe and Lara today. I'll be introducing them in just a little bit. So before we get started, just some etiquette for webinars. I think you're all probably well versed in this by now. You will have noticed that your mics will have been switched off on arrival. And if you could just turn your video off as well, if it is on, it just helps with, you know, the bandwidth as we sort of project out and you kind of load into our session today. The presentation will be available afterwards on the Kantar website. We will be sharing that with you in the thank you mailer. And the webinar video recording will also be available, which will be shared in the webinar video and on our social channels. So don't panic, you'll be able to have access to that afterwards and to share it with your colleagues. But with no further ado, let me introduce you to our speakers. So today we have Lara Byrne and Thandiwe Chipeya. Thandi, welcome. I'm going to do a quick introduction so people can find out a little bit more about you. And of course, a big shout out to Mamta Mithal, who was also part of putting the presentation together and will be part of the conversation ongoing if with any questions that we have going forward this month. So to introduce Lara first, Lara Byrne is the Client Service and Qualitative Expertise Director. So Lara is a storyteller, and I think what more could you ask for than a data specialist to be putting stories together? I think that's a primary requirement these days. Lara is a client partner, brand strategist, and dog lover. Lara holds a master's degree in social sciences and kicked off her research career in 2004. Lara has spent 8 years serving at board level for South African, Sub-Saharan and Southeast Asian businesses. And it's this experience that has broadened and deepened her understanding of consumer business and consumer realities. And we're going to hear a little bit more about the reality we are all facing today. With client and project portfolios spanning more than 25 African, Middle East, and Southeastern Asian countries, Lara's expertise lies in the domain of brand strategy, specifically helping her clients position, challenge, extend, and grow brands into market leaders. In addition, Lara has a unique ability to help businesses craft customer-centric strategies that are designed to fuel growth. And then with moving on to Thandi. Thandi is an Associate Account Director for Kantar, and with 10 years of qualitative research experience, Thandi has worked in all facets of qualitative research in design, facilitation, and insight generation. And maybe you'll have to unpack these for us, but from FGDs, IDIs, fusion groups, online groups, immersions, shopper connects, and more throughout East, West, and Southern Africa. She also has delivered ethnographic insights to global teams in the UK and Switzerland. Thandi holds a postgraduate diploma in business management from Gibbs and University of Pretoria, and a BA in marketing communications from the University of Johannesburg. She is currently completing her master's in business administration with Gibbs. Of all her roles, being mom to 2 daughters has been the most fulfilling and challenging yet. And just a big welcome to both of you today. Just checking, there we're getting your microphones on. How are you guys doing?
All good, Paula. Thank you for that intro.
Great. Super to have you. Yeah, I know we've got a fantastic session ahead of us. Just a reminder, I think, to the audience that and a big thank you to them for joining us today. We've got an incredible set of guests from agencies to publishers to brands to education houses, all ready to hear about your insights from Kantar. And if you've got any questions to our audience, please share them on the chat. It is a private chat, so I'll be receiving those, and we'll be asking those live to Thandiwe and Lara at about quarter to 10. And anything that we can't answer due to time, we will reach out to you personally and share that via email. All right, handing over. Thanks, ladies.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you for having us this morning. So it's quite an interesting space that we find ourselves in right now. We find ourselves in a post-lockdown, pre-vaccine, socially distanced state, and we're not quite sure where we are. Our task this morning is reimagining the future with you guys. It's a co-creative piece. What we have done is tapping into the global community that Kantar has. Kantar has done a global study qualitatively across 13 markets. So it includes China, it includes Indonesia, it includes quite a few countries, Africa included as well. Just a little bit of context. Where are we now, and what does this mean for us as brand architects? What does this mean for consumers? So we're in a space where, since the beginning of lockdown, our realities have been recalibrated. And by recalibrated, what do we mean by that? We find ourselves in a space where our normal is not the way that we've known our normal to be. We're finding ourselves in a space where we're having to learn new behaviors, where we're having to pick up new behaviors, where we're also having to learn how to undo some of the behaviors that some of the behaviors, woo, and then the English bundles do the things. All right, so what Kantar has done is, through the series of our COVID barometers and our global piece that we've done, we've uncovered and unpacked some of the hidden tensions and challenges that the consumers face. And through this we've taken a cultural lens to understand, number one, what are the needs and realities that individuals navigate during this complex COVID world. Also, what behaviors of everything that we've learned to take, as well as everything that we've learned to let go of, what of those behaviors is likely to continue into the future? And then lastly, what does this all mean for our participants? And what does this mean for our brands? And what does this mean for our clients? Authentic empathy is something that continues to come up. In our global it's come up in our global barometer, and it's come up from this qualitative piece as well. And authentic empathy speaks to a science or a piece where consumers are feeling like, I'm tired of brands talking to me and talking at me in a way that's not necessarily empathetic, in a way that doesn't necessarily speak to my reality. In order for brands to speak to consumers in an empathetic way, or in a way that makes sense to consumers, you need to adapt. You need to adapt empathy. And in adapting empathy, we need to find our space, we need to immerse ourselves in our consumer realities so that we understand where consumers are today and the spaces that they exist in. So where are we now? In this piece, I'm going to take you through some of the realities that our consumers are navigating or have been navigating through our COVID reality. So we find that social bubbles have given way to physical bubbles. In 2017, we found ourselves in a space where we were debating, oh my word, are we spending too much time on social media? And what are the impacts of us spending so much time on social media? And now, post-COVID, we've had to scrap that debate, and we find ourselves in a space where we've got physical bubbles, where we're physically distanced from the communities that we've existed in. For most of our, this physical distancing rather has given us some really, really insightful insights, but also we've had some pleasant surprises. I mean, for the first time, we sat in a focus group in an online group rather, with a 74-year-old participant. COVID, we would have thought, no, we wouldn't put a 74-year-old online, you know what I mean? And this particular participant that we sat in an online group with, she felt like, you know what? I've got one granddaughter, and the only thing standing between me and having a relationship with my granddaughter is either I embrace technology and social media and everything that it brings with, and because now through technology and social media, I'm able to have a relationship with my daughter. I'm able to actively partake in my daughter's bath time in the evening through video and screen time. And then we also find ourselves in a space where our home is now the center of everything. And pre-COVID, our home was not necessarily set up in this way. Our home is not set up to be our everything. Our home is not set up to be our office. It's not set up to be an entertainment space. It's not set up to be homeschool. It's not set up to be a gym. It's not set up to be all of these things that home is now finding itself fulfilling. Through this, consumers are now having to carefully consider the comforts and the things that they put into place to enable them to exist and enable them to do everything that they're needing to do from their home. While all of this is happening, quarantine fatigue is setting in for some of our participants. A lot of the people around the world, it's not a South African phenomenon, because you're spending so much time online, you're finding that I'm having a little bit of a difficult time balancing, and I'm having a little bit of a difficult time switching off, because I'm on Zoom meetings during the day, I'm closing one screen to open another screen for entertainment. I'm putting away one screen to sit in front of another screen for home workout. So all of this is starting to contribute to a fatigued state, or a continued fatigue state, where consumers are feeling like, I'm not getting any breaks in my day. I'm not getting any moments in my day where I can stop and I can breathe and I can regroup. But through this time, consumers are still keeping busy. Consumers are still keeping busy. They're still cooking at home. They're still engaging in continual activities where they are now finding themselves in a space where they're moving from just being consumers of content to being creators of content. We're learning new skills, and all of these skills that we're learning now more than ever, we're finding the time, we're finding it more important for us to share, be it via TikTok, be it via Instagram, everything that we're doing. Overall, consumers are feeling like we're in a state of flux. No 2 days are ever really the same. I go from one moment where I'm enjoying the fact that I've got these people in my bubble, I've got these people that I'm living with, and I'm appreciative of these moments. But it very quickly changes to frustration. It very quickly changes to I'm feeling I'm suffering, or I'm struggling with cabin fever, in lack of a better way of putting it. And then lastly on the slide, consumers are feeling like they're not backed by the system. Consumers are finding themselves in a space where we're feeling vulnerable. We're having healthcare workers that are feeling vulnerable because of the physical lack of PPE equipment. But then also in the same breath, we're also having participants just on the left of that picture. We have in Russia where restaurant owners were protesting naked, saying that the lockdown regulations have left them naked. They don't have an ability to make an income, and being incomeless can be equated to being naked. Just over the slide, we continue to discuss some of the spaces and areas that consumers find themselves negotiating. One of the things that COVID has made clear for our consumers is that we're living in circumstances that are not all equal. consumers are feeling the inequality. For some of our for some of our lower social segments, they found themselves in a space where I'm having anxiety in terms of where is my next meal coming from? My living circumstances are not allowing me to quarantine and lock down and spend time in this space. But also, even in our upper social segments, we're finding consumers saying, the fact that I do have money available does not necessarily guarantee that I'm going to find toilet paper on the shelf. It does not necessarily guarantee that I am not going to run out, I'm not going to be able to acquire some of the essentials that I really need. It's also brought about a feeling of we're not safe. If you're a woman in the world, regardless of first world, third world, it's a continuous conversation that we've seen that consumers are not safe at home. There are increased tensions, there are heightened tensions, right, English? There are heightened tensions that you're feeling trapped, you're feeling vulnerable. And this feeling of vulnerability is a single most powerful feeling of vulnerability. It extends across both men and female, in the sense that whoever, and again, across social classes, whoever you are, wherever you're sitting in the world, you are experiencing some element of vulnerability, be it vulnerability in the sense that my income isn't what it used to be, vulnerability in the sense that I may contract the virus, and if I do, will I survive? Vulnerability in the sense that I'm spending so much time in isolation and away from the people that away from the energies and the people that feed me so richly. So whatever shape or form your vulnerability comes in, the focus for marketeers needs to be, you need to find a way to connect with people through this vulnerability and help them work through it in this post-COVID journey. Through this vulnerability, participants as well as communities have found safety in each other. We've found safety in connection, and we've found safety in community. We're finding in countries that were very individualistic, in the UK, in Russia, we're finding that there are spirits of volunteering. These activities make a personal difference for the participants that are taking part in. But then also in more affiliative countries, like in Africa, we are mobilizing ourselves in groups and in communities, helping each other out in ways that make up for the deficit, or that make up for the deficits in governance. And then nostalgia and anchoring in the good old days. This is something that consumers tend to do, even pre-COVID. But what it's meant here in this particular context is that participants tend to find comfort and safety in things that they know, especially when you find yourself existing in a world where there is so much happening and there is so much around you and there is so much uncertainty. When there are so many things that you can't control, it's easy, or it becomes easier for participants to revert back to nostalgia. And what we've seen during our COVID reality is that we've recreated some of these moments that allow us to live these feelings that are very familiar. We've recreated moments that allow us to cook together, that allow us to bake together. I was speaking to a friend that has said for the longest time before COVID, they never spent any marketing effort promoting baking powder. But during lockdown and during COVID, baking powder was just an item that you could not find on the shelf. And now they're thinking, what do we do with this item? Do we promote it? Do we just let it sell itself? What do we do with it? And then lastly, brands do find themselves in a place where they do have a bit of a tightrope to walk post-COVID. And the response so far has been, do we ignore it? Well, you can ignore it, or you can be mindful of it and be alive in that moment and communicate and speak out in that moment, or speak empathetically in this moment, tapping into our consumers and to our consumer realities. So having understood or having spoken through some of the changes that individuals and households are going through, what then happens to societies? What then happens to cultures? What happens to cultures on a functional level? What happens to cultures on an emotional level? How do we relate to each other? And what are some of the effects based on what we've seen so far? What of these behaviors are most likely to stick and what are most likely to be let go? What are we most likely to let go of? Lara's going to take us through our cultures and where our cultures move to post this reality. Thank you, Lara.
Thanks, Thandi. So one of the things that we started with is forming a cultural lens through which to understand the human beings in our study. And culture is a really important lens to look at a very basic level. It's the most human way to understand people, and the lived experience of what it must mean to be going through a time like we are going through at the moment. It's pretty extraordinary. We're unlikely to experience something like this again in the future. Sorry, Tan, there's something happening with the screen. Let me just go back. There we go. Oh, goodness.
Technology has a mind of its own.
Tan, can you just hand over control? Thanks. Okay, cool. And a cultural lens is actually also really important for marketers. It's the single most powerful way in which to build resonance. Why does this keep happening? It's the single most powerful way to build resonance, particularly when you're working in multicultural contexts. It is the basis of lived experience, and it's also the single thing that binds us. So across markets and across the world where we see differences, cultures, what we all have in common. So one of the things that we've done is we built a framework that helps us look across both the individual markets, understand them in their own rights, but also build a framework that helps us look across the markets at scale to understand what binds them together. And what we have here are 6 dimensions that, regardless of which market you're working in, regardless of whether that's South Africa or Indonesia or America, these are really important lenses through which to understand human beings. And this is what binds all the people in our study in terms of the lived experience and the response to COVID, and more importantly, the ways in which behaviors are likely to stick or shift in the future. So if we understand people through these 6 different lenses, you're in a much better position to anticipate what the future might bring, particularly as you start to understand those behaviors in a shifting context, because that is what happens in times of crises. Cultural values, socio-cultural events like a COVID pandemic do shift behaviors, and they do shift particularly along these 6 dimensions. So it's a really useful place for us to start. We'll look at each of these in some detail, but it's really important for us to know, why does this keep... Sana, are you skipping ahead, or is it...
It's technology doing the most.
Okay, it's a bit unsettling. So if you can just like hands off the keyboard, and I'll own your laptop from remote. Sorry, everybody. Okay, so the very first lens to look through is obviously relationships and how human beings are connecting with each other or how they're disconnecting from each other. But we're seeing a major shift in this space. People are moving from a programmed, scheduled, logistic-driven life to one that is much more discerning. I don't know why this keeps happening. It's one that is much more discerning. This did not happen last night when we dry ran. Entertainment is another lens through which we are understanding human beings at the moment, and we're seeing... Sorry, everyone. This, of course, is going to happen while we're live, right? Entertainment and what we and what behaviors are shifting. The single biggest shift around entertainment is the need for human beings from being entertained to actually creating those moments for themselves. And that's both for practical reasons, because the lockdown in many countries, in particular in South Africa, prevents people from accessing traditional ways in which they have historically been entertained, and forcing people to carve out those spaces for themselves. But they're also really intuitive and emotional reasons and needs that people are connecting with shifts in entertainment. People want to be more discerning about how they spend their time, because now more than ever, their time is being heavily policed and marshaled and carved out in new ways. Thirdly is work. A really important tension for human beings that's evolving quite significantly is the relationship that people have with their work. The job, as it were, the notion of that, the definition of it has shifted significantly in people's heads already. And people are starting to think about what that might look like in the future. So attitudes to work are definitely starting to shift. And a new conversation seems to be emerging around value creation and individuals' role in that. People are seeing themselves as members of a productive workforce, and really either feeling quite vulnerable because they're questioning whether they will continue to add value in the future, whether they add value now, and also feeling quite unstable or unsafe in those spaces, because the question then becomes, will I have a job in the future? What will my job even look like in the future? And so that's giving rise to different behaviors and how human beings are responding to that. Either they're equipping themselves with new skills, learning new professional skill sets, or they're thinking about ways of work in a slightly different way, side hustles, etc. We'll look at this again in more detail. A fourth lens through which we're seeing behaviors evolve is around money. Understandably, people's livelihoods now more than ever are more in question. People's incomes are in tangible terms being threatened. Why does this keep happening? It's almost like it just wants me to move along, right? Sound from the universe. I don't know what's going on. I'm sorry, I just have to keep skipping back. Everybody, forgive us. Okay.
Lara,
so people's relationship.
Would you like
yes.
me? I could upload the PDF, or are you happy to try and continue? I know that there were a couple of changes since then. Maybe we just keep continuing. I'm sure it'll be fine.
I hope it will be fine. I think
Okay.
I'll just get off the slide. It seems to be the slide that seems to be the problem. I
Okay.
don't know if there's an animation that's, or it's a glitch in the background that's running.
Okay.
I've only got 2 more boxes and then I'll move on.
Perfect.
So many people are moving from a sense of accumulation to protection and conservation, because of course our livelihoods, our incomes are threatened more than ever. And as you step down the levels of socioeconomic brackets, that gets really gritty at the bottom. So livelihood genuinely is under threat for many people, and how they think about money has already shifted dramatically. In terms of leadership, both in very tangible terms from politicians and governments and systems, the way people see those institutions has evolved significantly. The demand from human beings is for more transparency and for less hierarchical, pyramidal ways in which those systems organize themselves to forms of leadership that are much more collaborative and flatter in structure. What's interesting about leadership, though, is that human beings are not just expecting that from institutions like governments and parastatals, but also from brands and corporate. The thinking seems to be that in times like these, action and relating has got to be authentic and real. So we've got someone who said in our study, if they value humanity, if they are not just about making money, making profits, making quotas, if they actually focus on real people and the challenges that we face today, then they would really stand out. So what's interesting is that consumers on a human level are acknowledging that it matters to us as marketers that we stand out to them. But the threshold, or the way in which we're being held accountable, is very much how you show up as a leader, as a corporate citizen, as it were, with good values and good authenticity. So leadership has definitely shifted from this pyramidal, hierarchical, old school system to something that's much more collaborative, much more authentic and transparent. And then finally, no surprises, health. Our relationship with our health has already shifted dramatically. There's been an acknowledgement across the board, across societies, and particularly in South Africa, that we're vulnerable, and taking personal responsibility for your health is just not enough, that you have to do more than that. And there's actually no really good guarantees that taking care of your health will guarantee in the future that you're going to be okay. So people are moving away from these pop a pill, fix a problem approaches to health to a much more holistic, pragmatic approach to health. And some really important themes emerging around this and behaviors that are changing in this direction being hygiene, immunity, well-being, and how people think about their energy. So look at these in more detail. The presentation wants to move on in a hurry. So let's look at some relationship changes in detail. What's really important about relationship and the new behaviors that are emerging is people want to invest more time in healthy relationships. They're letting go of, excuse me, letting go of transactional relationships that are not very giving or rewarding in return. And that's what we mean by saying people are more discerning. And communication itself is shifting from the social calendar, the social circuit, to emotions. How do you feel? Connecting is happening on an emotive level, not just through the doing, because of course that's quite constrained in contexts like South Africa particularly. But investing in people and not being indifferent is something people are turning away from and wanting to be much more engaged with those around them. The family has taken front and center stage. So people are saying things like, although I'm physically alone, video calls have humanized my interactions. And my calls start with, how are you, really? And then I move on to, how is your family? And that for me is the best 5 minutes of every call. And it almost has become a social faux pas to not show an interest in how people are on a human level and to understand how they're doing personally and emotionally. It's become a much more deeper level of connection that people are insisting on. In relation to that as well, people are also curating a life, and curating being a very intentional use of the word. People are making moments that feel more meaningful and actively disengaging in things that don't build connection in those spaces. Gender roles are shifting, so relationships in the home in particular, what fathers do, what mothers do, men and women in the home around house chores. Out of necessity, men are spending much more time at home, and there's much more collaboration in that space. Digital connections, a digital relationship doesn't forego digital facilitates those relationships, people using that as a platform in which to connect, and using that connection as nourishment, as a kind of shelter from the dramatic and sometimes quite fraught feeling space that COVID is leaving many people experiencing. So what's being let go of as a result of that? Well, saying yes to everything. People are not interested in transactional type of communication or relationships. They want to connect quite meaningfully and will actively distance themselves from relationships or conversations that feel quite superficial. No one's taking things for granted. So, every conversation or showing up in your relationships is really, really important. Making people feel like they matter to you is, or rather forgetting that people want that from you. That's sort of being let go of. The family is much more centered than it's ever been. This is something people have, we know from previous studies that the family and spending more time with family is something people have often struggled with in the past. COVID, in an interesting way, has made people just prioritize that much more easily than they've ever been able to before. And of course, physical touch, finally, it's really very important for emotional and mental well-being, and it's greatly missed, but it's been let go of. It almost feels quite taboo to be in a space. And if you see a long lost friend in a shop, your immediate reaction is to go and hug them, but you hold yourself back because you're sort of, well, I don't want them to feel like I'm putting them at risk, or so physical touch has become something that people are much more considered about. Over the slide onto the next theme, because this presentation just wants to skip along. Entertainment is where we're seeing another shift in behaviors and cultural impact of this pandemic. People are moving from a need to be entertained to rather creating those pleasurable moments. It's now about filling space in a way that fulfills our needs, from just about being consumption, from being about more than just consumption rather, to creation and action. So this is someone who's talking about doing that in lots of different ways. So it feels like I need to be doing something all the time. I had an FB account but never posted. Now I'm accepting challenges, putting myself out there and learning new skills, but also sharing in my journey when I'm learning that skill. It's definitely opened up my entertainment. I contribute. Heck, I even now have a TikTok account. So people are talking about using digital spaces not only to connect with others, of course, but to be entertained in that space, but also to demonstrate the different ways in which they are occupying their time learning new skills. So new behavior is much more mindful. People are getting back to, so Thandi spoke earlier about where are we now? One of the things that people are doing are anchoring in the good old days, old behaviors, nostalgic behaviors that connect them with the past in some way. So getting back to nature, cooking, rediscovering old pursuits, revisiting old favorites like board games or movies or books, media content, the classics, and then also forming online connections. So two very different kinds of spaces that people move across, the sort of nostalgic, getting back to your roots approach, as much as getting online and using that as a space for entertainment in new ways. Gaming and multiplayer online portals are more popular than ever. And that's definitely on the rise across the board. Interestingly, what is a new behavior is takeaway as a kind of default, or delivery meals. People are less trusting of that, but are also less likely to use it as a form of entertainment at home and to feed the family. Instead, that's shifting more to special nights, and even the way people are relating to what food they choose in those spaces when they do use them on special nights, that's also shifted. So behaviors are being let go of. People are no longer decompressing in social spaces, obviously. Less passive screen time. So if you're going to use your screen, it's going to be because you want to be entertained in a way that's quite meaningful, mindful. People are more mindful about how much time they're spending on screen time as well. The default for takeaway has almost completely been left aside. And of course, in South Africa, holiday planning has all but dwindled completely. Over the slide onto leadership. Every single one of us, we hear across the board, across markets, even in our own country, the topic of leadership is a hot one. People are acknowledging that all of us are responsible in some way. And this is a response to two things. One, there's an acknowledgement that as human beings, we have a collective responsibility for each other, for our health, for the societies and communities we find ourselves in. But it's also, and in markets like South Africa, especially a response to failed governments, or governments that have been, weighed and found wanting. So it is a survival instinct to want to attach yourself to leaders in times of crisis. And in markets like across our continent, but in South Africa especially, where governments are quite patchy in their response, human beings are very quick to assess where their gaps are. And the response to that is to fill the gap. Of course, they're very discerning and quite critical of how governments are responding, or parastatals are responding. But the response also is to do that for yourself. Interestingly, though, the same kind of measure that governments are being held up against, so too are brands and corporates, businesses. The big brands have shown their true colors. They've done nothing to help, but want the government, and therefore us, through our taxes, to bail them out. I want to hear what action brands are taking, and not having them tell us how good they are, but genuine action. It's not just about them looking good. So leadership is not a beauty contest, and showing leadership is something that consumers in particular expect from brands. But they're also telling you that the chance for hit and miss is quite high, because it can't just be about parading. It can't be about showcasing all the good you've done. It's about genuinely connecting. And that's quite tricky. That's, we acknowledge that that's not a simple job to get right. So what are the new behaviors? Well, we're seeing, interestingly, people are prepared to let go of things like rules, following those rules rather, if it means that it's going to help the common good, generally speaking. We know that that's quite uneven in different parts of our country particularly. Trading in privacy for safety, people seem much more willing to do that. The pandemic has sort of raised the question of, is my privacy more important than my safety? People tend to be saying, well, actually, I'd rather have safety than privacy. Being alert and aware, people take a personal responsibility of being connected and having their finger firmly on the pulse of information really, really matters. Personal leadership on the rise. This is both about the consciousness of every one of us has a spark of leadership, but also there are genuinely failed initiatives at a government level to macro level that have not come to light. There have been lots of promises, but nothing has really landed on the ground in some cases. And so there's a response for mobility at a neighborhood community level. Volunteering, donating, mobilizing those resources is something people have taken responsibility for. And then calling out any self-serving behavior. There's a big call-out culture that seems to be emerging during the pandemic. And this is not an entirely new behavior, but it comes from a place of not wanting to have this beauty contest parade itself. Anyone who's sort of coming across as tone deaf or harmful in a public space, including brands, faces the wrath of being called out in those spaces as well. So in general, people are not putting themselves first, focusing on family and community, and generally not trusting in the government to do it all or even completely right. No surprises there, I guess. Work is evolving significantly. This is a big conversation point in our study, in South Africa in particular. Work has historically provided continuity, stability, and the pandemic has turned all of that on its head. And the notion of a job seems really fragile. People are really getting to grips with what job security will look like in the future. And there's a real sense of this cannot be taken for granted. Even if you have a job, your income and the way that you earn money is potentially going to shift and is very much under threat. And for very many South Africans, in fact, even having a job is something that has been taken off the table. And what that's given rise to is a shift in attitudes and a new conversation around, well, what does work look like for me in the future? It's no longer understood as something where you go to work, you earn a salary, you go home. That's all being reevaluated. So the new behaviors that go with that really are flexible hours. And this is an interesting term because it sounds really like a perk. Oh, I've got flexi hours. It's not. This is where the crunch is happening. We spoke earlier about the home being the place where everything's converging. Schooling, shopping, working, relaxation, connecting with your family. It's all happening in one space. So having the flexibility helps to manage all those spaces, but it's also a source of pain for a lot of people. E-learning, so this is a way in which to upgrade your skills, learn new skills, grow your professional portfolio in ways that will equip you better in the future. This is a coping mechanism, but it's also an acknowledgement that the future maybe isn't a single skilled future, that actually the future belongs to those who can very quickly switch hats, move quite quickly, pick up contracts here and there. The side hustle, so everyone has a side hustle or knows someone who has a side hustle. This is both about monetizing a skill set, but also about supplementing income. So the idea of a single income is very quickly being reappraised. Pressure to demonstrate that you're working. So, work is happening at home. Businesses require you to be online. And we're still trying to negotiate the difference between being at an office 8 to 5 versus being at home and being present and visible 8 to 5. So people are actively managing their visibility and needing ways in which to do that, using tech to do it. And then finally is the introspection on the value of time, money, connection, really thinking about value creation and what your role as a worker in the workforce genuinely means. What's been let go of? Well, we don't socialize with our workmates. Remember about relationships we spoke about earlier, meaningful connections. They're your workmates, not your mate mates. There's a lot of that conversation around, I just don't do that anymore. Physically, it's not possible, but also you're just not investing the time when you have it. Decompression post-work is almost disappearing. People feel like they're on almost 24/7. They do that to manage their visibility with businesses, but also it's quite difficult because you're also managing a whole lot of other things in between, like schooling your children, doing the shopping, looking after kids, doing house care and housework. So that boundary between work and home is making decompression, in fact, finding time to yourself harder than ever. People feel like they're working harder than they've ever worked before. And then the balance between creative reflection and group interactions. For many people, they feel like they're doing both those things at the same time. There doesn't seem to be a lot of mental space where you can step out, reflect creatively, and then come back to the group. It feels like those two things happen almost simultaneously because of the way our homes are set up for work. So this is someone talking. I'm working reduced time, contract work has stopped for my husband, our bills keep mounting up, I have started selling my sketches, and these are things I used to do on the side just for fun. So that's the side hustle, the monetizing of a skill set, and the need to supplement income. Over the slide, onto money. This is our second to last dimension. Oh, let's just skip ahead again. So people really are feeling quite vulnerable in the space. Vulnerability is a universal emotion across the COVID experience at the moment. But we're seeing the shift from accumulation to prudence and protection. People really do feel the loss of money stability. And really people are wanting to have a lot more guided help around how they can protect and conserve their money. And it's translating into shopping behaviors in a very different way across the socioeconomic bands, right at the top all the way down to the bottom. People are having to adopt much shrewder, savvier coping mechanisms. So what is new? People are obviously more judicious, more moderated in their approach to spend. People are focusing more on saving and paying attention to products will help them do that more fruitfully. Essentials, what was considered essential, has been completely redefined in the spaces, particularly on personal care, skincare, cleaning products, vitamins. Shopping more frequently to manage the scarcity, but also to manage shifting incomes. So what used to be, monthly or every second or third week shop is now a weekly shop. So people are managing that, they don't know what their income is going to look like in the future. They don't want to be spending great big amounts of money on food and supplies. The desire to educate oneself around financial planning, and financial service providers that are able to do that are definitely being paid more attention to. And then extra sources of money, so supplementing your income, not having a primary earner in the family, but multiple earners if that didn't exist before, and taking on additional jobs. What's being let go of? In the leisure space, sport and gardening, obviously, but cooking and anything around that space is definitely being dialed up because there is this return to the good old days. Experiences, for obvious reasons, the lockdown has made experiences variable across different markets in South Africa specifically, but people are also much more judicious about where they invest their time on experiences and doing a lot of that at home. Reliance on the employer or a government as a single source of income, people are much more interested in self-sufficiency. And any service providers are able to dial that up or plug into that need and that tension are going to do much better in the future. And then individuals are looking to beyond money for hope and inspiration. In fact, we see faith and religion in some markets, and South Africa is definitely one of them, where faith has become a much more stable source of inspiration. Money has just become a means to an end for some. Over the slide onto our last dimension of cultural shift. So the idea, health obviously is going to come up in a pandemic. What is interesting about how health behaviors are shifting is that people have acknowledged their own mortality on a very manifest level. And they're also accepting there's a personal responsibility for it, but very painfully acknowledging that no matter how much you do, you're still quite vulnerable. So the new concept of health is much more holistic. It's not go to a doctor, tell them your symptoms, they give you a pill and you treat the symptom. People are looking for much more holistic approaches to their well-being, particularly in the spaces of hygiene, immunity, energy. What is new is there are definitely new routines, new behaviors in the household geared up for hand washing, disinfecting. Of course, that wouldn't surprise anybody, I guess. But a much more proactive approach looking after one's vitality has come with that as well. And people are prepared to spend money when they have it on those things. Cooking at home is for two reasons. One, it's a safety thing, making sure that you're able to control the safety of the ingredients that go into your dish, but also focusing on local, fresh, easy to access, also in some cases sustainable ingredients. An increase in exercise. Anyone's driven to work or driven along the roads early morning will see a proliferation of suddenly newly committed runners and bikers and walkers. People are using exercise and virtual exercise online platforms as a way in which to address and take control of their health, as well as vitamins. What's being let go of is street food culture, closest for strangers. Everyone is taking hand washing quite seriously. What used to be a sense of, oh, I have this gym contract, I wish I could use it, I wish I could be more motivated, that shifted. People are finding themselves much more naturally motivated. Unhealthy habits, particularly around fast food, where there is quick serve retail, people are shifting, the demand is shifting to much more healthier options. And wanting to be very clear about how their food is handled. Contactless deliveries, those sorts of things are definitely replacing old behaviors. Okay, so I guess the real big question is which of these, damn this presentation, which of these behaviors that are changing are likely to persist in the future? And more importantly, for I guess the people on this call, is where growth will come from. So we know from our local barometer study that actually South Africans, interestingly, are much more worried about their finances and the economy than they are on their own health. So we thought of those 6 dimensions, it would be good to drill down on money. This is a chart, I don't know if you can see it really nicely, but you can see the health concern, the measure for it is much higher than it is for others. So with that in mind, we've used the Kantar model for behavior change to understand what behaviors have more potential versus less potential. And that's what this matrix on the right of your screen really is. The behaviors that sit up against the left-hand axis for motivation and ability, those are the behaviors that are most likely to persist in the future. And just carving up this matrix and explain to you how it works. And just to contextualize, this is a post-lockdown or kind of current lockdown, pre-vaccine, socially distanced phase. Any change in those factors could mean a change in some of these behaviors as well. So there are two axes, the y-axis and the x-axis. The motivation element is how inclined and motivated are human beings to engage in that behavior in the future. Obviously, if it's a larger motivation, we can see really high potential. And where there is ability is the other axis. Ability is, how able are human beings to absorb this behavior into their current repertoire of behaviors. And ability is actually defined through three, whether someone is able or not to work with that new behavior is defined. We look at the likelihood of that through these three lenses. Is it culturally a fit? So does this behavior intuitively fit with my current customs? Does it mirror it in any way? Obviously, if it clashes, it's going to be quite difficult to sustain or harder to adopt. If it mirrors it, then of course it's much easier. Is it easy to do, like physically easy to do? Then yes, obviously it's going to be more likely adopted. And then the cognitive effort that is required to adopt that new behavior, the less cognitive effort, the more likely. So effectively those behaviors that have a lower degree of effort associated with them and are highly motivating, those are the behaviors that are much more likely to sustain in the future. Motivation is looked at through 5 different currencies. We call them currencies because nobody would say that any one of these 5 is less important than the other. And so what humans do, what we all do, is we say money matters, but in this situation, as I'm making this decision, is money more important than time? Is connection more important than safety? And so we trade these currencies off against each other, but they're currencies, they're all very important. So if a behavior dials up more of these currencies, then it's much more likely to be adopted in the future, particularly if it's one that works with the cultural, practical, and cognitive ease. So that is basically what the framework is about. We assess the way in which humans are more or less motivated and more or less able to engage in a new behavior. So with that, I'm going to hand you over to Thandi, who's going to look at money and what behavior change we're likely to see in the future. Hand over to you.
Thanks, Lara. So taking on or picking up from the 5 currencies as well as the abilities, one of the other things that we do need to take into account is that behavior change doesn't necessarily happen outside of the environment. So the environment is an important factor that also needs to be worked into the model. External forces in this context could be personal motivation, it could be how easy it is to adapt, but also it could include regulation, it could also include elements or levels of support that need to be taken into account. It could include our changing rules. We're finding that our rules are changing, our rules for shopping are changing. We'll speak a little bit about it in the next slide. But also it also takes into account the availability of the resources that you have at hand in aiding this new behavior adoption or in aiding this new behavior change. Okay, this presentation and the gremlins, it moves when you don't want it to move, and when you want it to move, it doesn't move. So what we're gonna just basically look at now is an example of this behavior change model that Lara has spoken us through. So looking at this model, in the middle of the model, more like in between our 2 quadrants of high potential and low potential, we've got our shopping there. Our shopping is currently sitting in the middle, because it's one of the behaviors that have medium potential to be changed, depending on the individual and depending on the factors that Lara has spoken through. So taking shopping more frequently as an example, we see that shopping more frequently straddling high potential and low potential in terms of the motivation space. Why does it look that way? It looks that way taking into account the cultural fit, the practical ease, and the cognitive ease. Is we're shopping more frequently right now for a number of reasons. The motivation factors they're sitting is, I'm shopping more frequently because getting out and going shopping is a way for me to get out of the house, is an escape, in lack of a better way of putting it. It's a moment, or it's a way for me to change my environment, to change my scenery, in lack of a better way of putting it. But then with that, it also takes into account there are some other practical drivers in this space. I'm shopping more frequently because I've got more people in the house and therefore we're consuming a little bit more. I'm shopping more frequently because I don't have enough space, or I don't have enough storage space for bulk buys. Those are some of the ability factors, or those are some of the ability factors that we need to take into account. Now, post-lockdown, is this a behavior that we're most likely to see continue? Yes and no, or yes and no, but given the way that it's sitting on this quadrant, is it's got medium potential. And then part of the other factors that, part of the currencies that you also need to take into account now is you've got safety and you've got vitality coming into play when you're thinking of shopping more frequently, or that are, or as drawbacks in shopping more frequently. You're thinking safety, okay, me stepping out of the house, I am a little bit more exposed. I am increasing my exposure. I am thinking about, oh, it's an arduous task in the sense that I've got to queue outside of the store first. And then there's also these regulations that I need to adhere to while I am shopping. I went shopping the other day, and literally I'm one of those people, I'm a chronic sanitizer. And like I literally sanitize my hands chronically. My skin was starting to peel off. That's how much I did it when I was out in store. But thinking about some of these currencies, then for me, shopping more frequently is a behavior that's less likely to stick because of the safety and the vitality impact that comes with it. So what does this then mean for marketers? So from a brand perspective, or from a retail store perspective, you're wanting participants, or you're wanting consumers to shop a little bit more, because with them shopping more, there's an increased chance of spontaneous buys or impulse buys. With them shopping a little bit less, there's also the potential of decreasing your foot traffic in store. Depending on whatever your marketing objectives are, we can partner with you to develop the ideas or the frame, working together, pulling together the currencies as well as the motivation factors that enable you to position or put together some pieces that drive behavior change in the long run. And then lastly, we've taken you through where we are. We've taken you through what are some of the changes participants are sitting in. We've also taken you through some of the behaviors that have changed. We've taken you through the framework model that talks to us about that with the interplay of motivation and ability, and how we gauge what behaviors are most likely to stick versus what behaviors are less likely to stick.
Right. Thanks. Thanks, everyone. And also just again, a shout out to Mamta for helping to put together the insights that were shared by Lara and Thandi today. We are drawing to a close, but I think, we have been talking quite a bit about the stickiness of certain behaviors. We've been talking about, what's happening now, but how does one as a marketer potentially for this particular audience, I suppose we're all consumers as well, but as a marketer, or someone enabling marketing, how do I help understand my business in terms of what behavior should I be repeating as a marketer? Maybe we could learn from past crises. I know, Lara, we were just chatting, on the group now. Do you have any insight to share in terms of the stickiness, but transferring it to the future, potentially a guess at using the past to make a forecast on, maybe once there's a vaccine? Do we have any idea of what behaviors might stick?
Yeah, Meg, we're lucky in that South Africa goes through waves of volatile change socially, and the epidemic is, of course, the most augmented version of change and impact that we've experienced in our lifetimes. But if you cast your mind back to sort of the early 2000s, South African time of recession, double dipping economy, we have seen consumers respond to those significant changes at a social level in terms of their consumer behavior quite dramatically. And so the question of what behaviors are likely to stick versus, what is a temporary response to that change? It's a good one. It's a great question because it's the lifeblood of where opportunity and growth will come from. The single point to make really is that the behaviors that are likely to stick in the future are the ones that are motivating and the ones that serve a psychological need space. We can work with you on your individual categories, your brands, to understand what those important need spaces are, but it's very much about the consumer that you're working with. So there isn't a one size fits all for all consumers. There are tribes of consumers. Our barometer that's coming out now will talk about those tribes in more detail. People are motivated slightly differently. So I'll give you an example. We had some really high SEM consumers who talked about having to cut the fat, and they speak about it in a very kind of novel way. It almost felt psychologically rewarding for a double recession or a double dipping economy to force them to adopt some of these new behaviors. And actually we have seen, retrospectively looking now, those behaviors stick. That group of consumers is known to be sometimes quite disloyal depending on what category you're working in. The rise of the house and private label is from that time and from that consumer who switched into brands like Pick n Pay and Woolworths and Checkers house brands because they were very comfortable making those trade-offs. The double dipping economy forced them to find these creative ways to get back to fat in their budgets, and house brands helped them do that. Private labels helped them do that, and that behavior stuck in the future. Why did it stick? Because it's really motivating for them. They managed to free up the fat in their budgets and get back to a slightly more comfortable way of living than they were initially experiencing in that double dipping economy. For other consumers, however, it's harder for those behaviors to stick because it's painful. So where those behavior changes come with pain, or it's difficult to adopt, it doesn't fit into the cultural fit very well, or it's practically quite difficult, or creates a lot of cognitive discomfort, then no, those behaviors are going to be quite transient. But again, one size doesn't fit all. You really have to be very close to your consumer, know what motivates them, know what their tensions are, their need spaces, and then respond, because that's the only way to know to be able to anticipate better what their behaviors are likely to look like in the future.
No, I think that's a great answer. And again, thank you to Belinda for the question in the audience. I think throughout all our Kantar sessions, understanding your audience, and I think, right in one of our first sessions, I think it was your, Woolworths, who said, it's that dynamic understanding. I no longer do a survey to understand, or I not only engage or do a qualitative or quantitative analysis of my consumer or my market, quarterly, or it's almost daily, and there are tools to do that now. And I think just a dynamic understanding of the context and of people is just so relevant. So thank you.
We don't live in a world that's permanent anymore. The world we live in is, this phrase gets thrown around a lot. I get tired of hearing it, but it's a reality. We live in a VUCA world. It's volatile, it's unpredictable, it's chaotic. It's very difficult to anticipate needs being very stable. But there are some things that are anchored, and psychological motivations and the ease of cognitive fit and cultural fit, those are much more stable. So working with human beings at a cultural level is the single biggest and best way to navigate that complexity and that volatility.
Well, thank you. And I think we could spend a session on each of those
yes.
dimensions. They're just absolutely incredible. All those behavior change, that you're noting, and we're very excited to see what comes out in the next barometer. So a big thank you. I know we've run out of time, and we'll answer any of the other questions via email. Is there anything, Lara or Thandi, that you'd like to say just in closing, or we're happy to sign off. It was a fantastic session. Thank you.
No, just thank you for having us. It's always lovely to be able to share our work. Just thanks for hosting us.
Great.
Stuff that we find fascinating. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Thandi. And Q&A is ongoing. So in the thank you mailer, you'll see our contact details, and we'd love to hear more from the audience. And a big thank you to everyone for attending, and to Kantar for the insights today. So thanks, everyone, and see you in 2 weeks. Ciao. Have a great Wednesday.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.